Apache was an implementation of HTTP. MySQL was an open source implementation of the SQL standard. Linux is an open source implementation of the POSIX standard. And Eucalyptus, we see ourselves as an open source implementation of the Amazon APIs, which we claim are a de facto standard. But when I say this, people get angry with me. They say, Martin, no, that can't be true. AWS, that's a closed standard, it's a single company, it cannot be a standard. And I say, come on guys, they have 90% of the market. Look back at what Microsoft did 30 years ago and how Windows became the dominant design of client-server. And everybody tried to resist. And the legacy companies started their own projects and they built OS2, which was technically superior but couldn't win. So we believe in this amazing power of the Amazon APIs that goes way beyond Amazon themselves. And it's a very interesting question now in the industry whether that's true. Is that how it will play out? Because when I say this, others come to me and say, oh, Martin, you're so wrong. There's Google and there's Microsoft and there's the OpenStack consortium. And I say, well, they won't matter because Amazon has such a huge lead. And it's not just about Amazon, it's about the ecosystem that is built around it. But we're in the middle of it, so we don't have the answer yet. That was my minute.
Okay. Yeah, what I find really interesting about what Martin just said is he's going against the grain of open source. OpenStack is the pure play open source model, and Martin.
What's pure with it?
Well, it's community consortium driven. It's an open standard. It checks all the check boxes.
Yeah. What check boxes?
Sorry. You used up your minute. But he's saying, well, I'll take a closed standard and I'll implement it open source. But let's circle back to Greg. Greg, can you?
Yeah, what OpenStack is doing is taking an open standard, implementing closed source, because that's what most OpenStack vendors are doing.
They're taking an open. They're taking an open standard and implementing it as closed source code. So, Greg, can you talk a bit about two things? One is you took over Mulesoft when it was very young. It was what, 4 years ago or so, 5 years ago, and I don't know if you disclosed revenue numbers at that time, but it was very young, and now it's very mature with very high repeatable revenue, high valuation. Talk about that journey, what changes you needed to make, and also what the customer journey is, and how they first find the product, become aware of the product, decide that they need the commercial version, they need to pay for it, etc.
So when I started, it was about 20 people, 15 in San Francisco and half a dozen other places, and now we just went over 330 this week. So yeah, there's been big growth over that time frame. Yeah, the customer journey is we try, and Martin kind of said it well about trying to make sure that you make it just super easy for people to use your product. And we actually started a lot like I think the way Eucalyptus started too, where there's the RTFM mentality, and we actually kind of were even worse than that. It was like read the code if you got a question. So we spent the first year kind of basically telling people to read the code, and then a year later we were telling people to read the bad docs, and then we got to reading okay docs. Now we've got them reading good docs or better docs, still not very happy with where they are. But then we started moving toward everything being packaged, everything being graphical tools. You're trying to get to the most broad base of developer possible and still leaving it open for what we call the high priests of Java to do their thing. So if somebody is really hardcore and they want to get around and muck around with get down to XML and do whatever they need from a configuration standpoint, we give them that ability. But if somebody is a very basic developer and they can use our graphical tooling, click on a couple connectors. We've got samples and templates there. They can kind of map, if they're going Salesforce to SAP, they can kind of find a template to get going with it and get up and running and fairly productive pretty quickly. And they may be missing the last 10% of it, and they may need their friend's help next door to get them kind of over the finish line, but they can get most of the way there. So that's kind of how our customer experience has changed over time, or user experience, I'd say.
And what about,
No, this, yeah. And what about the changes you've had to make in the company over the course of your tenure?
Yeah, it's, I mean, to hear you refer to it as a mature company, it doesn't feel very mature. It still feels like we're kind of at the awkward teenage stage. But it's certainly been from a company that was, very, early days, you had kind of a combination of immaturity of the organization, but also just kind of in terms of its being focused toward purely adoption, and then growing it over time. We've had to move it toward, a lot more making sure that we keep being a product company, but also making sure that we've got great outbound marketing and, really building an amazing sales model. At the end of the day, I mean, if anybody's here is an entrepreneur, I'd say, the first thing you want to be thinking about after you kind of get the project off the ground and you are seeing that traction is you want to have a person from the leadership side, on the sales side, that will help you really transform that business into something that feeds the rest of the company. And I always kind of go back to, I think some purists kind of have a bit of a philosophy of they kind of get a little almost negative about the monetization aspect of it, but at the end of the day, unless you're monetizing, you can't fund the product development. And we've been able to take it from a core team of, when I joined, was half a dozen developers. Now we have over 100 developers, and that's all because we can fund it, and we just pour, the dollar spent as a percentage on the open source part has probably gone down a little bit, but the absolute spend on open source has gone up by a factor of probably 5 at this point.
Thanks. And Mark, you have a very sophisticated model, very quantified, precise model of the customer journey. I don't know how much of that you can share, but I think that would be very interesting as to how you view the top of the funnel and what the various stages are.
And I didn't answer your other question, so I'll be real brief. The company, when I joined, was primarily out there pitching Scala versus Java. Scala is a language that runs on the JVM, and as Salil said, it's pretty damn hard to monetize a language. In fact, I think it's impossible. You can monetize around it through services, of course, but you don't sell a language. But what we did in the first 6 months after I got there was figure out, okay, where is this language in the frameworks, the Play framework and the Akka framework, where are they being used and what kind of use cases are they? And we landed on something that is a category that's been out there, but we kind of have adopted it. It's called reactive, and so we see ourselves as leading this charge towards reactive application development and the platform that runs those reactive apps. Quickly, it means it's an event-driven based system. It's scalable up and down. It's resilient, fault-tolerant, built into the system as opposed to after the fact, and it's responsive, customer interaction, right? So apps like Guilt.com, if you're familiar with a shopping site where they have their flash sales every day at noon, that's very scalable because it needs to deal with that huge volume. It's highly interactive on the phone app. Another app that's using our stuff is Nest, right? The Internet of Things, the thermostat in your home, collecting not just how you're changing your temperature, but also all the information about the environment, right? The weather outside and so forth. And then the other one that everybody here is familiar with is LinkedIn, right? With their engagement platform and services. That's all, I shouldn't say all, but much of it's built on our stuff. So Salil asked me to say, or give you some kind of insight into our model. One of the things I've learned over the last 14 years, especially targeting developers as your primary audience and then trying to monetize through the development phase, but ultimately really monetizing when they roll it out into production, is you need to make sure that you know about the projects, you know who the developers are at the starting point. Well, with open source software, especially open source software where it's out in the community, and you can get all of our stuff without ever talking to TypeSafe, we don't know who those people are. So if you can't find out who they are, you have a tougher time figuring out how to make sure that they're successful. And that's what really matters, is getting those development projects that they're building. The first one is probably the most critical. Make sure they don't fail. Make sure that if they're going to struggle, that you've addressed any issues that they encounter. So we have something at TypeSafe that I've borrowed from many companies and just experiences that we call the reactive journey. And it's nothing more than the adoption phases or life cycle of a developer in a company and how they pick up the technology, what they do at each phase, whether it's exploring, just trying things out and building a prototype. And at that phase, clearly we want to make sure that they're getting content, right? That they're getting appropriate help on how to build a particular type of an application. So that if it's a use case, we'll target them saying, if you're trying to build a mobile app that has a back-end Hadoop big data platform, here's a sample code, here's a tutorial, here's a video that shows you how to build that kind of an application, and here's a case study or 10. So this journey is nothing more than just at each phase making sure that the individuals get what they need, and for us, on the commercialization side, we find out where they're at. And so we have a product, this is something that Rod Johnson and I talked about doing at VMware, actually SpringSource before VMware. We have a product called Activator. It's a developer experience tool, and it's a web app. And in that web app, you use these tutorials, you experience different parts of the platform. At each phase, we can see what you're doing, and therefore I target, or the product targets content for you, whether it is a tutorial or it's a screencast of a piece of software, or it's a video or something like that. At each of those steps, we can see what you're doing, therefore give you the right content. And ultimately, we monetize during the appropriate time. So if it looks like you need help on a training front, we'll sell you a training class or promote a training class to you. Or if it looks like you're ready to roll out into production because you hit deploy, you're going to get a commercial that pops up that says you have a choice. You have the commercial distribution from TypeSafe, or you can distribute it on the open source stack. And of course, one you pay for and one you don't. So this allows me as a manager of the business to see how we're doing, but it also allows us to be very precise in all of our efforts, whether it's marketing effort, it's community development efforts, and evangelism, or product efforts, right? Where do I need to put more energy on the product side? So, and I'm pleased to say it's working very well.
And Martin, I don't think you need any prodding from me, but why don't you just take us out of the monologue session by telling us what's going to happen to cloud, on-premise cloud stacks? Is it going to be OpenStack, Amazon? What's the proper way to think about it?
That's a great question. So first of all, there's a school of people who thinks that now everything is moving to the public cloud and on-prem environments will just die away. I happen to believe that's not the case. I think all economic systems will always settle on a balance between owning and renting. Old data centers will go away because they're so complicated to manage, but the new ones that you build on private clouds are actually very efficient to manage and operate. And today, if you are a CIO, it's a dilemma. It's actually a trilemma, because you're sitting there with VMware and you're completely locked in with VMware, and the only thing you can do is give them more money. And when you give them more money, they bring you software that they call cloud, and you say, I'm running a private cloud. I don't believe it's true, but that's what's happening. On the other side, they are losing, the CIO is losing internal customers to AWS, because internal customers saying, okay, I've had it, I'm going to the public cloud to do it faster. And that's where we think we play an important role in being at the complement of Amazon to run on-prem. So we go to the CIO and say, with Eucalyptus, you get your own Amazon region on your own premises, and you can tune it and configure it the way you like. And then there's the third part of the trilemma, which is the whole OpenStack consortium, where every single legacy vendor, every incumbent vendor who is threatened by AWS and by Google, and to some degree by Microsoft, they banded together and created this OpenStack project, which is enormously powerful, because they have every large vendor backing them. IBM, HP, Cisco, Intel, Red Hat, Rackspace, AT&T, you name them. They're all there building an open source private cloud platform. So what do you do? And then, this is not all of it, there's CloudStack, which arguably was the first cloud team to get their product in really good shape. So hats off to the CloudStack team for their engineering skills. But as a CIO, you're sitting there saying, what should I do? I would like to have a unified data center, but I'm completely locked into VMware. I cannot resist what's coming from the OpenStack consortium, because it's all my main vendors driving it, and they're doing hardware certification, and they have gear that is designed for it. And then they're looking at the AWS dimension saying, but this will happen, and the future is as defined by AWS with agile development. So how does that play out? We are playing in that game and we're seeing things happening. It's very early today. We've just learned that of those who look at OpenStack, 40% are looking at Eucalyptus as well. I would love for it to be 100%, but given that we are a small startup and we are battling tens of thousands of people out in the market, I think it's a good share to have 40% attention there. So it's very much open, and I think CIOs will end up doing all three of these. They must have an AWS play, they cannot abandon VMware, and they cannot resist the lure and attraction of OpenStack. Does that make sense?
That's fascinating. Yeah. Let's take a couple questions. Now that time